welcome to Like Maria. Today I'm talking about 5 frames from the Wong Kar-Wai film Fallen Angels. Now this might be a slightly niche choice, as I imagine not that many of you are studying this for A-level film studies. However, I know there are loads of Wong Kar-Wai fans out there, so hopefully you'll enjoy a quick look at this film. Now this film is a companion piece to Wong Kar-Wai's probably more famous film Chungking Express. And whereas Chungking Express is set during the daytime in Hong Kong, Fallen Angels is completely set at night time. It's got a very different look and style, but certainly I'd recommend looking at both pieces together. Originally, Fallen Angels was going to be the sort of third act of Chungking Express, but it would have made the film overly long and it works really well as a standalone. Now, Wong Kar-Wai has a very particular style as a director, and we would absolutely describe him as an auteur. His narratives are particularly interesting, and the way that he delivers the story, playing with time and space, means that the audience has to be really engaged and active in their viewing. We'll talk about some of his auteur characteristics during the video, but some to mention are the way that he uses colour and neon, the way that he represents Hong Kong, and often Hong Kong as an extra character, the sort of inner struggles of characters, the chance meetings, the coincidences, and one of the things that's really visible to me is the sort of influence of MTV, which we have to remember would have been very different when Wong Kar-Wai was a young man. It was full of vibrancy, lots of fast videos being shown, all of them with fast cut editing, and we can really see that reflected. Another thing to think about is genre. Many auteurs work outside of genre boundaries, and therefore their films become difficult to label as specific genres. So for example, Fallen Angels might be considered to be like a crime film. It's definitely got elements of film noir in there. There's elements of romance as well, and also it's quite funny, so we might label it as a comedy. Bearing all of this in mind, it might be more useful to think about Fallen Angels as a postmodern film, and we'll talk more about that later. So my first frame has got to be this one from right at the very beginning of the film, partly because it's so different to what comes afterwards. It sets up the audience's expectations in one way, and then those expectations aren't fulfilled. And we're taken on this narrative journey that doesn't always make a huge amount of sense. This shot is really memorable because of lots of different things, really. The use of the black and white film stock, which is particularly grainy in its look. The canted angle that feels very disorientating, the awareness of sort of position in the frame with the woman in the foreground and the man in the background is similar to elsewhere in the film, where sometimes our agent is sat in the foreground staring off into the distance and there's a huge amount of action going on behind her, for example towards the end of the film. Her performance in the foreground of the shot is full of impact as she smokes, and we almost see her constantly smoking, but here as she smokes she's shaking, and so this is obviously a really big moment for her. And this is one of the only moments where we see the two of them together in the same frame. Normally they inhabit completely separate spheres, even though the agent hangs around in places that she knows the assassin has been to. So she goes to the bar that he frequents, she cleans his apartment, she even masturbates in his apartment. So even though she visits these places and hopes to see him, we very, very rarely see them in a frame like this. And because this is a two-shot, we might expect some intimacy between the two characters, but they don't even look at each other, they don't make any eye contact. So whatever she's trying to tell him at this point in the narrative, it's taken a lot of bravery for her to say what she says. She's very nervous about it, we can see it through that cigarette that's shaking. She has a deep desire for him, an unrequited love for him, and that is a lot of the motivation for the film. But she doesn't get a response. They don't actually talk to each other at this moment. The voiceover that comes in, the voiceover of the assassin, talks to us, the audience, but doesn't talk to her. And it talks about how an agent and an assassin should never get involved with each other. This is a disastrous relationship waiting to happen. So I'd just like to take a moment to mention the assassin here. How cool does he look? His costume, that part of mise en scène with its open neck, his body language, he looks really relaxed. Obviously, we don't know at this point that he is an assassin, but if we did, we'd be able to kind of make the assumption that being an assassin doesn't really seem to bother him. He doesn't seem to have any misgivings about killing people. I read in an article that Wong Kar-Wai's men are cool, whilst his women are sort of beautiful but also kind of kooky and a bit quirky in their characters. Later, this idea of him being cool is reinforced through their Massive Attack inspired soundtrack, which literally has the lyrics "Because I'm cool." Apart from the shaking cigarette, there's hardly any movement in this shot. It's very still, and this is reinforced by the camera as well, which lingers in a long take. So we're forced to look at the pair of them for quite a long time, which again is going to be very different to the shots that follow, which have often a sort of frenetic pace to them. Another reason why this shot is interesting is because of the sort of film noir vibes that it gives. It plays on some of those film noir tropes, and quite clearly the agent is playing the sort of femme fatale kind of character. She's quite glamorous, and we can see her makeup here. Later on we see how sometimes she's quite provocatively dressed. Because we see them first, we expect these two characters to be our main characters. To push the narrative forward, we expect that we're going to follow their journeys. And of course, again, that isn't the case. To some extent, we might say that they're our main characters, but equally we could argue for other characters that we see as well taking that main role. And of course, in terms of timeline, we don't actually know when and where this sequence takes place. As we cut out of the title sequence and we follow the agent through the subway, we assume that this is a flashback to earlier. But essentially, the start to the film creates this really experimental approach to narrative. So here we're playing with genre, we're playing with narrative, we're trying to establish who the characters are and how they're connected to each other. And really, none of those questions are going to be answered in the shots that follow. So my second frame is from one of the funniest moments in the film, where the assassin is on the bus and he is recognised by one of his old school friends, an insurance broker who ends up trying to sell him life insurance. That in itself is quite funny because of the irony of selling a life insurance policy to someone who is so casual about life and is responsible for ending the lives of many others and works in a very dangerous job. But it's not just that irony that makes it funny, it's also the performance of the friend who's really over the top in his delivery, really desperate to sell him some sort of insurance to boast about his own career and the fact that he's going to be interviewed in the paper and so on. So all of this is quite funny. And then, of course, the assassin's reaction to this as he's kind of talking about his so-called life. This is where we learn a little bit of the backstory of the assassin. The fact that he did have a life before this moment is shown to us through the fact that he's got an old school friend. But we also discover that everything he tells the school friend is a lie. He shows him a picture of his wife and child, but actually he tells us that this is just someone that he's asked to pose for a photograph. And this is where we see some features of post-modernism. There's definitely an ambiguity to our characters in this film, and here he is proving himself to be an unreliable narrator. If he tells lies to the people around him, it's quite likely that he might be telling lies to us as well. And actually, how much depth is there to his story anyway? Like many of the characters in this film, he's completely rootless. There's no wider family around him. He lives a very isolated life. He's also a bit nomadic. He moves from place to place. Again, like a lot of the characters in this film, he's moving around all the time. We very rarely see him in his actual apartment. I think we see the agent there more than him. And this really reflects some of Hong Kong's history, which has been described as a city of transience. Because of British colonial rule, which lasted till 1997, there are a lot of expatriates living in Hong Kong, but also a lot of refugees. People feeling like they moved to Hong Kong as a sort of stopgap before they move on to somewhere else. So perhaps the fact that the assassin is so rootless and has this kind of throwaway attitude to life is partly reflecting Hong Kong's wider history. Going back to the idea of the assassin being cool, we can see this reflected in the mise-en-scène, in the costume. So we can see the insurance man with his shirt and tie and his goofy facial expression compared with the assassin wearing his vest. He's got his little chain and he looks less involved in the conversation. Wong Kar-Wai has said about him, everything is image, and his character is incapable of communicating, of contact with real people, even with his schoolmate. So he disassociates himself with his past and he disassociates himself with the people that he kills, obviously. But is this sense of cool style over substance? And this is another postmodern feature. Again, we might think about whether or not there's any depth to this character. One thing that we might note is that he never kills anyone without an appointment to do so. So perhaps despite all his nomadic ways, he's actually someone that needs structure, and he doesn't particularly like this moment because it's a surprise. It's not something that his agent has arranged. One other thing to note as well is that obviously as an assassin, he must already be aware of his own death. He must assume that because he kills people, at some point somebody's going to kill him. So he's got no sense of history, but he's also got no sense of future. And this touches a little bit on one of the things that Wong Kar-Wai is really known for, which is playing with time and space. Often in his films we see a lot of clocks and watches, things that keep track of the time. In something like Fallen Angels, we might say that something like the jukebox has got a clockwork type mechanism as it plays its music. So although in the frames that I've chosen we're not going to see any of those images to do with time, we could argue here that the assassin's whole life gives an ambiguous idea of time. No history, no future. So for my third frame, I've chosen this one of the agent in the assassin's apartment as she masturbates on the bed. And I've chosen this one because it captures a lot of what's interesting about this film. Firstly, it's got that almost neon quality in terms of colour. The colours of Wong Kar-Wai films are described as lush and lurid, which I think we get that impression here. I mentioned before that you weren't going to see any clocks, but here in the very background of the frame, we can see a clock on the wall. So we have got that little nod to time. But one thing that's really interesting about this shot is just how weird it is and how uncomfortable it might make us feel as an audience. This whole film and a lot of Wong Kar-Wai films have got a feeling as if we're watching almost through a fishbowl. Wong Kar-Wai himself says the cameras, the way that they're positioned and the way that it's shot gives a sense of sort of surveillance. And famously, this film was shot with an extremely wide angle, with the camera very close to the actors, which gives a sort of odd, close but very far away kind of feeling to the shots, and creates that sort of dreamlike quality which is part of the entire film. And this is opposite to what the director of photography does in Chungking Express. So again, going back to that idea of companion pieces. But all the shots in the film feel slightly weird, slightly uncomfortable. Instantly the audience has to sit up and pay attention to what type of film they're watching and what type of experience they're going to have. Now going back to this shot specifically, the composition is really interesting. The thing that our eye is drawn to are the fishnet tights of the agent, which are in the foreground, which create this crisscross pattern all over her legs. But actually, if we look at the frame itself, it's full of lines, it's full of checks, it's full of patterns. And maybe this is to do with a sort of fragmentation that young people in Hong Kong might feel, a sort of mismatch of identity, the sort of tradition of Hong Kong alongside the modernity of Hong Kong, and young people trying to find their place within that. But equally, maybe all these crisscross patterns are to do with her own frustration. Maybe they're to do with the dead-end relationship that she has with the assassin. It's very much unrequited love. Maybe it's to do with sort of sexual frustration, and of course that is what she's there for. She's kind of relieving herself in his space. And personally, I'm quite pleased to see her having a lovely time in his apartment, because later when we see her masturbate in his apartment again, she cries afterwards. She's fully frustrated. She knows the relationship isn't going anywhere. And it's from this moment onwards that she decides that she needs to end his life. So that is very much a sort of turning point in her feelings. The other times we see her in the apartment is when she's cleaning, and we see her doing things like scrubbing the floor, putting beer in the fridge, scrubbing the worktops, and she does it on more than one occasion. And we might question whether this is part of her job or whether it is simply part of her obsession, because one of the times she's there, she takes out his rubbish, and when she gets back to her own apartment, all the things in the bag are explored. She sniffs his sheets, she's taken his dirty sheets, and she also discovers matches that lead her to the club that he often goes to. So absolutely obsessive behaviour, and not the behaviour that we would expect from the traditional femme fatale. There's no doubt that she is the femme fatale. She's constantly smoking, and that phallic symbol was often used in those early film noirs. Her dress, she's very sexy. She's often wearing sort of PVC, black. Certainly she wears red towards the end of the assassin and agent storyline, where she's phoning and ordering his death. So visually she has all the elements that we would expect from the femme fatale, and the fact that she leads to the assassin's death is very femme fatale. But we never got to see Barbara Stanwyck cleaning her house, cleaning up after anyone else. So she's an interesting character. And if we think about representation of gender, we've got this strong, powerful woman who organises these very violent deaths. But we've also got a woman who struggles to cope with her emotions, is unfulfilled, and ultimately exhibits domestic behaviour. She might be in the kitchen smoking and looking really sexy, but she is still in the kitchen. So up until this point, I've made it seem like this film is a straightforward narrative between the agent and the assassin, but of course it isn't. And so my final two frames are about some of the other characters that we need to consider. So here we've got he and Charlie, and these are our other two main characters who really demonstrate this idea of chance meetings and transient relationships, or relationships that come and go. They first meet when Charlie is on the phone talking to her boyfriend. She finds out that he is going to marry someone called Blondie, and that kicks off their whole relationship. And a lot of their early relationship is basically her crying on his shoulder. She is fully obsessed with this boyfriend and tracking down Blondie, which is what we're seeing in this shot. They are searching some apartments to try and find where she lives, and they're sort of shouting abuse and interrogating people and so on. It's a very comical moment, and also the way that it's edited creates that MTV idea once again. But to give you a bit of background to these characters, when we first meet he, the police are looking for him, and there is an overlap between the two main storylines in that the agent tells him to stay hidden. He's a very comical character because the first time we see him, he bursts out of this cupboard surrounded by cigarette smoke. There's some intertextuality with this film and Chungking Express surrounding this character. For example, he lives at Chungking Mansions, so that direct link to the name of the film. And also he tells us that he's mute. He stopped speaking when he ate an out-of-date tin of pineapple. And tins of pineapple and checking the expiry dates is something that one of the characters does in Chungking Express. So there's that clear link between the two films and the clear link between the two storylines in this film. He is a very funny character. He has an unusual outlook on life. He decides he's going to find a job by breaking into other people's businesses and basically at night time use the business space and make money. And that means we see him doing all sorts of jobs, including giving haircuts to people that don't want them, taking a family on a tour in an ice cream van. There's a lot of humour surrounding him. But he is a really unusual character. And if you look at the relationship between him and his father, there are some really sensitive moments and questions about history and background. And the role of kind of modern technology, television and video within that. So once again, he demonstrates those features of postmodernism. His relationship with Charlie here seems to be particularly intense, like he'd do anything for her. And he tells us a bit later on that she is his first love. Going back to the idea of transient relationships, when they meet again later in the film, she doesn't really recognise him, or at least pretends not to recognise him. And he's doing all these things in the background, trying to sort of get her attention, pretending to be sort of shot by a gangster. He uses the ketchup on his apron, and she doesn't notice anything. Life has changed, she's moved on, and their connection is broken. He goes on to meet the agent from the first storyline, and it's these two characters that we see on the DVD cover. It's these two characters that ride off on the motorbike, and there is that chink of light, the only moment that we see sort of daylight in the film. So, in terms of experimental narratives, it's really unusual to have this amount of characters with these interconnecting storylines. And they're not just simple storylines, they are complex in all of the emotions that our characters experience. And just to come back to this frame specifically, I think this really captures the MTV look. It reminds me of something that we might see in a music video. If you imagine Charlie as sort of singing to the camera, it feels like that kind of narrative performance kind of element of a music video. And that's partly, again, because of those colours, remember, lush and lurid, but also the facial expressions, the props, the mise en scène itself. It's a two shot. This one has perhaps got a slight tilt to it, but in this sequence of very fast cut shots, there are more extreme angles and it feels really fast paced. You can say quite a lot about editing here because it uses a montage. We see different characters being interrogated at different times, and it's very elliptical in its style. So again, reducing the amount of time it takes to tell this part of the story. Eventually, this is the moment where they find the blow-up doll, which they claim is Blondie, and of course they beat it with a mop, they shut it in the door. Again, lots of humour created here, but still Charlie is completely obsessed by finding Blondie, and later on a fight breaks out, again sort of caused by this looking for Blondie. So it is really worth looking at these two characters and their storyline. They visit lots of different places in Hong Kong between them, and of course if we compare the beginning and the end of the film, it's a very different mood and tone that's created. We've got that black and white, very nervous, intense moment at the beginning between the agent and the assassin. And then at the end of the film, we've got colour, sunlight, we've got the agent, and we've got he riding off on the motorbike. So we don't get a neat end to the story, but we do get the sense that the story continues beyond the film. So my final frame I've chosen just because I really love this moment in the film. The idea that you can recognise that someone has been sleeping with the person you love just from a smell, I find really interesting. And we know that smell is a really important sense and is often connected to nostalgia. You know, we remember things from our childhood through smell. There are a number of shots surrounding this, and I really like the point of view shots that we see, and also the sort of reaction shots from both of the actresses here. I've frozen it on this frame because you can see both characters, and of course that allows me to talk about both characters. Now, we don't see the women talk to each other here, but in the following scene, Blondie says that she set up a meeting between the assassin and the agent. We also see the assassin and the agent sat with each other in the background of some shots, and as Blondie runs out into the rain. So this is perhaps the moment that actually we're seeing right at the very beginning of the film. Certainly some of the behaviour mirrors what's happening at the beginning. Now, I've referred to this character as Blondie, but I don't think there's anywhere in the subtitles where anyone actually calls her by that name. Do correct me if I'm wrong, put it in the comments below. In the cast list, she's also known as Punky. So I think there's something there about identity and it not necessarily being fixed, especially with this character with her blonde hair and the way that she looks. She's very different to everyone else in the film. Her performance as well is very physical. She's often bending in odd shapes and moving her arms into awkward positions. So she's a really quirky, interesting character, coming back to that idea of Wong Kar-Wai's women being kooky, for example. Her blonde hair shows the influence of Western culture, and we can also argue that when we first see her in McDonald's, that's another influence of Western culture. And that links again to Hong Kong's past as a British colony and the influence of Western culture generally. There is also, again, an intertextual reference with this character because there is the blonde character in Chungking Express, and she's much more important in that film and slightly more sinister as a character. Now, if she is the Blondie that Charlie has been looking for earlier on in the film, this raises all sorts of questions. Lots of enigma is created. For example, what has happened to the boyfriend that she was with? Why is she now seeking out the company of the assassin? She gives the assassin some clothes when he gets wet in the rain. And are these the clothes of the ex-boyfriend? Or is the assassin the boyfriend that Charlie was talking about? So lots of questions we might ask, and the assassin and Blondie have a fairly intense relationship for a short period of time. And the assassin acts in a way that we haven't seen him act before. He's looking for fun, he's enjoying himself. So he's a very different character to elsewhere. He hasn't at any point in the film seemed particularly connected to people. But here he seems to be having fun and ready to embrace the slightly chaotic lifestyle that Blondie offers. When he leaves her, he says, I'm just a stopover on the journey of her life. So again, that transient nature, that idea that relationships don't last long and that he's quite forgettable. And one of the things that she worries about is that he will forget her. So we've got that real feeling of passing through time and that sort of dreamlike quality that nothing is solid enough to grasp onto and keep hold of for a long time. Now, coming back to this shot specifically, again, we've got that oddness in the camera work in terms of feeling close but far away. And we've also got the parallel lines of the tunnel, and often tunnels and corridors in films signify a moving towards the end, sometimes death, which of course is what happens not long after this moment when the assassin is finally murdered. Okay, that has been a fairly intense look at Fallen Angels, and if you've made it all the way to the end, well done. Please do leave some comments below if there's things that you think I've missed or points that you want to make. It's such an interesting film to discuss and to think about. That's all for now. See you on the next one. Bye bye.